the wrapping paper that revealed a killer, a Miss Marple mystery. Welcome to Detective Notebook, a cozy corner where each story begins with the hush of a village evening and the promise of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps curled under a blanket with a cup of tea in hand, letting the world outside fade for a little while. I always love imagining the corners of the world where our listeners join these quiet mysteries. Picture this. Snow drifts softly over the lanes of St. Mary Mead, muffling footsteps and gossip alike. Lantern lights spill from frosted windows, glinting off icicles hanging from the eaves. Somewhere, a postmistress whispers about a stranger who left at dawn, while the faint scent of pine and burnt candle wax lingers in the air. And yet, among the gentle quiet, one scrap of silver-belled wrapping paper flutters unnoticed under the vicarage door, torn, deliberate, and mysterious. But whose secret does it conceal? And who will notice it before it's too late? If you love calm yet clever mysteries, subscribe and join the Detective Notebook family, where every whisper might hold a clue. So settle in by the fire, take a slow breath and listen closely. Tonight, the story of the wrapping paper that revealed a killer begins. Chapter 1. The Morning After. The first light of Christmas morning crept gently over the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead, turning the thin veil of snow to silver. A hush hung in the air, not the peace of the holy day, but something quieter, heavier. Somewhere in the distance, a blackbird called once and fell silent. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling lazily upward, and the village began to stir. At the vicarage, a curtain twitched. Inside, the maid sobbed into her apron, while the vicar stood pale-faced by the hearth. Word had already begun to slip beyond those walls, as news in a village always does, quickly, quietly, and with a touch of embellishment before breakfast. By the time the church clock struck 8, whispers had reached the grocer's, the bakery, and the lane that led to the post office. A guest, they said, was found dead beside the fire after the Christmas Eve gathering. So sudden one voice, so unexpected another. No one yet said the word murder, but it floated unspoken in the cold morning air. Miss Marple sat at her small table by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone lukewarm. Her neat cottage overlooked the lane, and from her chair she could see the top of the vicarage chimney. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, though she wasn't thinking of tea at all. Her blue eyes, still sharp beneath the soft lace of age, followed the postmistress bustling down the lane with her scarf tied high against the cold. Mrs. Crabtree always knew more than she ought to, and looked as though she rather enjoyed that fact. Moments later, the woman was joined by Mr. Clegg, the butcher, who leaned in close. Whatever he whispered made Mrs. Crabtree's eyes grow wide, and her gloved hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She knew the rhythm of village talk as surely as the ticking of her mantel clock. The smallest pebble dropped into still water, and the ripples reached every doorstep. When Mrs. Crabtree finally entered the post office, she found her friend Mrs. Finch already waiting for her, eager, of course, to be the second to know a terrible thing. Mrs. Crabtree began breathlessly fumbling with the mail.
The vicarage, and on Christmas of all times. Hot trouble, was it?
Asked Mrs. Finch, eyes bright with interest. I say he was sitting right by the hearth, looking peaceful. She leaned in. But the doctor says it wasn't natural. Across the street at the corner shop, the grocer was already telling the same tale to anyone who'd listen. And each retelling added a layer of dread or fascination, or both. Some claimed to have heard a struggle. Others swore they'd seen a light burning at 2 in the morning. A boy said there had been footprints in the snow leading toward the churchyard, though they'd vanished by dawn. By 10, the story had made its way back to Miss Marple's doorstep, well polished by gossip and quite a bit more colourful than it had begun. She received it with a gentle nod, the way she might accept a gift she'd already unwrapped. When her visitor, a neighbour bearing mince pies, finally left, Miss Marple set down her cup and looked toward the vicarage once more. She recalled the fate of the night before, the laughter, the music, the crackle of the fire, and that man, the guest with the clever hands and the eager smile. He'd been helping wrap the parish gifts, she remembered, and she'd noticed something curious even then, the way he'd folded the paper, not torn but sliced with precision. She rose, adjusting her shawl, and moved to the window, the light catching on her spectacles. Outside, the snow gleamed white and innocent. But in her mind, the image of that wrapping paper remained vivid, neat edges, too deliberate to be casual. Villagers might chatter over tea and guess at accidents or poison, but Miss Marple knew better. People could hide their tempers, their debts, even their sins, but they could not hide their habits. A man who cuts paper cleanly is not careless by nature. She allowed herself the smallest sigh. Christmas Day, and already the world seemed intent on mischief. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, the paper wasn't just torn, it was cut. And with that single thought, the morning's gossip turned in her quiet mind into the beginnings of a puzzle. By midday, the calm of Christmas morning had shifted. The vicarage, once bustling with laughter and song the night before, now stood subdued beneath a thin veil of falling snow. A black motor car rolled into the lane, its tires crunching softly over the frozen ground. From it emerged Inspector Craddock, a broad-shouldered man with kind but watchful eyes, his breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. He paused at the gate, taking in the tidy garden, the wreath on the vicarage door, and the faint echo of church bells that seemed strangely mournful now. The villagers noticed his arrival almost instantly. Curtains twitched, and figures paused in their doorways, pretending to sweep or fetch logs while keeping an eager eye on the stranger in uniform. Inspector Craddock was not unknown to St. Mary Mead. He had been there once before, years ago, for an unpleasant business involving a poisoned sponge cake. He remembered the place well, and privately. He remembered the old lady who would quietly solve that mystery long before the police had. At that very moment, Miss Marple was trimming her holly bush by the garden gate, her gloves dotted with flecks of frost. She glanced up just long enough to recognize the man. He raised his hat politely.
Good morning, Miss Marple.
I dare say you've heard the news. One can hardly avoid it, she replied, her tone mild. I've learned it's better to let such news come to one naturally. It's more accurate that way. He smiled faintly. Quite so. I'm afraid I'll be troubling your neighbours today. Routine inquiries. Of course, you'll find the most helpful, she said, clipping another branch. And some perhaps a little too eager to be so, Craddock nodded, and with a brief farewell made his way to the vicarage. Miss Marple, without any visible curiosity, went on tending to her holly. But as she snipped and tidied, her ears were keenly attuned to the sounds of conversation drifting down the lane. Through the crisp air came fragments of voices. Mrs. Finch, the baker's wife, declaring she left the fete early before the games began. Yet Miss Marple distinctly recalled seeing her still there when the clock struck 11. Then young Tommy Clegg, the butcher's boy, insisting he'd never gone near the vicarage that night. Curious, Miss Marple thought, since she had seen his bicycle leaning against the fence by the rectory gate. She bent to gather fallen sprigs, her movements unhurried, but her mind quietly sorting and arranging each inconsistency. By mid-afternoon, the inspector had moved his questioning to the green, where a small crowd had gathered under the pretence of feeding the birds. He spoke kindly but firmly, jotting notes in his book. While the villagers tried their best to sound innocent and informative, the talk turned to gift, parcels, and ribbons, to who had brought what and to whom. It was Mrs. Harper, ever dignified, wrapped in her fur-collared coat, who mentioned the missing parcel first. I remember distinctly, she said, a brown paper package under the tree, not one of mine, I assure you. But by the time we cleared up, it was gone. The inspector's pen paused. Gone, you say? Yes, quite vanished. I assumed it had been claimed. Craddock thanked her and made another note. Behind him, the postmistress piped up that she'd lent her red ribbon to someone at the party, though she couldn't recall who it had been. for wrapping a last-minute gift. Now, it too was missing. Miss Marple listened from across the hedge as the faint details wove themselves into something far more tangled. A missing parcel, a borrowed ribbon, a guest dead by the fire. It was always in the small domestic things, she thought, the tiny, ordinary moments where truth slipped through unguarded. When the inspector finally made his way down her lane, the daylight had begun to fade and the air smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool. He paused by her gate once more.
You'll tell me if you notice anything, Miss Marple?
He asked lightly. Oh, my dear inspector, she said with a gentle smile. I've noticed quite a lot already. He chuckled, shaking his head.
I don't doubt that. As he walked away, Miss Marple turned back toward her cottage.
Her knitting waited by the fire, but she lingered a moment longer in the cold. The village was settling again, pretending nothing was amiss, but she had seen the faces, the faint tremor in a hand, the forced brightness in a voice, and as she closed her gate softly behind her, one observation stayed with her more than any other. Of all the people she had glimpsed that morning, whispering, worrying, speculating, only one face had shown no surprise at all. Only Miss Marple noticed, who didn't look surprised. Chapter 2. A ribbon out of place. By the next morning, the frost lay thicker on the hedges, and the hush over St. Mary Mead felt heavier still. The church bells rang for morning prayers, but fewer villagers came than usual. Even the children seemed subdued, their laughter muffled as though the snow itself had grown solemn. At the vicarage, a nervous hush had taken hold. The windows were dim, the curtains drawn, and from the kitchen came the occasional clatter of pans. More nervous energy than cooking. Miss Marple, walking past on her way to the greengrocer's, caught sight of the maid through the side window. Poor Lily, red-eyed and pale, was polishing the already spotless table with trembling hands. It wasn't the first time Miss Marple had seen such nerves in a servant. Fear always settled hardest on those with the least protection. Not long after, as Miss Marple was returning home with her small basket of apples, a hesitant knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Lily standing there, her apron dusted with flour, eyes wide and uncertain. "Beg pardon, ma'am," she stammered, twisting the edge of her apron. But I didn't know who else to tell. Miss Marple ushered her inside at once, her manner kind but composed.
"Come in, child, sit down. You look as if you've seen a ghost. It's about the gentleman. The one who—" Lily's voice caught.
"The one they found." Miss Marple poured her a little tea, waiting without a word until the girl found her courage. "I was cleaning the sitting room this morning," Lily said, her fingers tight around the teacup, "and I found something under the sofa. Paper, ma'am. Fancy wrapping paper with silver bells and leaves printed on it. I thought it was from one of the Christmas gifts, but it's not like any I've ever seen here." "Silver bells, you say?" Miss Marple's tone was light, but her eyes sharpened. "Yes, ma'am."
Lovely stuff it was, shiny and smooth. I was going to throw it on the fire, but then I thought maybe it meant something. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind travelling far beyond the cosy little room.
"Tell me, Lily, have you ever seen that sort of paper sold in the village?" Lily shook her head. "No, ma'am. We only get the plain kind from Mr. Sims's shop. This one looked ever so fine."
"London sort of thing." Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her thoughts had already quickened.
"You have a good eye, my dear."
"I do believe you're right."
"That design, silver bells, you said, was sold only in one place, years ago. Harborough's of Regent Street. Very particular clientele. Quite expensive, too." Lily's mouth fell open slightly. "Then how did it end up here?" "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "What was such paper doing here, in a village where no one ever travels far?" The maid looked stricken. "Should I tell the inspector?" Miss Marple considered. "You've done wisely to come here first. The police have their ways, but sometimes small things get lost among the big ones. Leave it with me, child, and say nothing more about it for now." Relieved, Lily nodded, finishing her tea quickly. Before she left, she paused at the door. "There's one other thing, ma'am."
"I could swear I saw the same paper last night when they were handing out gifts."
"It was near the tree, but I didn't notice who had it." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That's quite all right, Lily. You've remembered enough. Go home, rest, and try not to worry. When the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while, staring at the pattern on her tablecloth as if it might offer a clue. In her memory, the image of that silver-belled wrapping paper returned, crisp and elegant, the kind a London shop might use for the holidays, the kind that spoke of sophistication and money. There had been a time, she recalled, when such paper had been all the rage among a certain fashionable circle, just before one of its members was caught up in a scandal involving forged signatures and vanished bank funds. That had been nearly 10 years ago. Could there be a connection? The thought stirred her curiosity like a match to kindling. Whoever brought that wrapping paper to St. Mary Mead hadn't come merely for Christmas cheer. The past, Miss Marple knew, had a habit of travelling quietly, hidden in parcels, folded into ribbons or tucked beneath a sofa cushion, and now that same past had found its way into her peaceful village, disguised in silver bells and paper too fine for local hands. She rose from her chair, moving to the window where snow still fell in soft, steady flakes. Beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, something had begun to shift, faint as a ripple, but undeniable. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her expression gentle yet knowing. "London," she murmured. "It always leaves fingerprints, even on wrapping paper." The afternoon sun was pale and uncertain, filtering through a gauze of mist, as Miss Marple made her way down the lane toward Willow End Cottage. The frost had not quite melted from the hedges, and the air held that crisp stillness peculiar to the days after Christmas, when the merriment had faded. But the remnants of tinsel and goodwill still clung stubbornly to the air. Willow End was a neat little house, set back from the road and framed by rose bushes now dusted in white. Mrs. Harper, the widow who lived there, was known throughout St. Mary Mead for two things: her sponge cakes and her sharp eyes. She had been married to a solicitor once, and though the man had been gone for more than a decade, Mrs. Harper retained an air of quiet authority, the sort of woman who noticed everything, remembered everyone, and forgot nothing at all. Miss Marple was greeted with warmth and just the right amount of curiosity. "My dear Miss Marple, what a surprise, though I dare say not entirely unexpected." Mrs. Harper's smile was polite, but her eyes gleamed with interest. "Do come in. The kettle has only just boiled." Inside, the drawing-room smelled of lavender polish and freshly baked scones. The widow poured the tea with practised grace, and for a few moments they exchanged the usual pleasantries: the weather, the village choir, the curious way the sparrows had begun nesting early. But soon, as often happened in such cosy rooms, the conversation found its way toward the subject on everyone's mind. "It's dreadful business about that poor man at the vicarage," Mrs. Harper began, setting down her cup.
I confess, I can't quite bring myself to believe it.
"On Christmas Eve of all nights. I suppose you've heard all the whispers?" "One hears a great many things," Miss Marple replied mildly.
But most of them don't hold up to the light. Mrs. Harper nodded approvingly.
"Quite right. Still, there are certain things that do stand out. For instance, I couldn't help noticing a stranger in the village some days before the fete. A well-dressed man, a city sort, you could tell immediately. He came to my gate, quite charming, said he was selling church decorations for the season. Silver baubles, ribbons, paper and the like." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, leaning forward slightly. "And did he seem the sort to be in that line of work?" The widow gave a short laugh. "Not in the least. Too fine by half. Perfect manners, perfect smile, shoes polished like mirrors. The kind of man who notices the lace on your tablecloth but not the mud on his own boots. I remember thinking, whoever he is, he's no tradesman." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, the spoon tapping faintly against the china. "And did you see him again?" "Once, near the vicarage. Odd that. He said he was selling to raise funds for the church, yet he never went near it. Passed right by, in fact, and went straight to the vicar's gate." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind had already begun its quiet work.
"That is curious," she murmured.
"Did he happen to mention his name?" Mrs. Harper frowned, sifting through her memories.
"Something ordinary. Brown, perhaps, or Bates, I can't quite recall."
but I remember his hands.
Long fingers, rather delicate.
The sort of hands that fold things neatly. Miss Marple's knitting rested idle in her lap, her thoughts circling that single phrase.
Hands that fold things neat.
The same sort of hands that might cut paper instead of tearing it. He must have come from London, Mrs. Harper went on. Had that way of speaking, smooth but never personal. And when he smiled, it was like he'd practiced in a mirror first. Still, I almost liked him, almost. Miss Marple smiled faintly. We're often meant to. The clock on the mantel chimed the half-hour. The tea had cooled, and the room had grown still except for the faint rustle of the fire. Miss Marple set down her cup and rose slowly. You've been most helpful, Mrs. Harper. Your memory is as sharp as ever. My eyes, maybe, said the widow with a sigh, but I sometimes wish they saw less. A quiet life is better for the nerves. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed softly, though quiet lives have a way of being interrupted. As she walked home through the fading light, Miss Marple replayed the conversation in her mind. A stranger from London, perfect manners, selling church decorations that never reached the church. It all fit too neatly to be innocent. When she reached her gate, the snow was falling again, light as dust. She paused to brush it from her sleeve, her eyes distant in thought. Whoever that man was, he had brought more than decorations to St.
Mary Mead. He had brought London, and with all its polished charm and quiet corruption, straight into the heart of the village. He said he was selling church decorations, she murmured, but he never went near the church. Chapter 3.
Threads of silver and lies. Morning came with a dim, silvery light that made the village look like a photograph, beautiful, but faintly unreal. The snow that had fallen overnight now gleamed like fine sugar across the rooftops. Miss Marple sat at her small writing desk by the window, a cup of tea cooling beside her, and before her lay the object that had occupied her thoughts since dawn, the torn scrap of wrapping paper. It was not large, just a corner, creased and a little smudged, but it was enough. The pattern was unlike anything she'd seen in years. Tiny embossed bells, each ringed with a thread of silver so fine it shimmered even in the weak morning light. The paper was thick, too, more like parchment than ordinary wrapping, and when she touched it, she felt the faintest texture of silk beneath her fingertips. Most people, she knew, would not notice such things, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime noticing what others didn't. She turned the piece over carefully. The back bore a faint watermark, the sort used by London stationers. Bramwell and Hinton, it read, in the smallest possible print. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had bought her Christmas cards there once, many years ago. It was the sort of shop that catered to a particular class of customer, the sort who liked their ribbons French, their ink Italian, and their paper discreetly expensive. When Inspector Craddock arrived at her gate later that morning, she greeted him with a pot of tea and an expression of mild innocence.
I do hope you don't mind my curiosity, Inspector, she said, as he stepped into the parlour, stamping snow from his boots. I've been looking at that bit of paper your constable brought round. He gave her a patient smile. I was afraid you might, Miss Marple.
You do have a way of making small things into large ones. Only when they are, she replied gently, offering him a cup. Do sit down, Craddock obliged, though his manner was brisk. We've sent the paper to the lab, of course, but I doubt it'll tell us much. Bit of fancy wrapping. Could have come from any gift. Miss Marple shook her head, slowly. Not quite any, I think. You see, this paper isn't ordinary. It's sold in London. Only a few places, I imagine. It's expensive enough that one wouldn't wrap an ordinary present in it. He raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting it means something? I'm suggesting, she said mildly, that someone wanted to hide something under the appearance of generosity.
A fine wrapping for something less fine inside, and that, Inspector, is a pattern worth noting. Craddock gave a short laugh. Every murderer leaves a pattern, is that it? Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. Every person does. The murderer's just happens to be more final. He looked at her thoughtfully. You think this paper ties to our dead man? I think, she said, that someone went to great trouble to bring a touch of London to our little village. People don't do that for nothing. There's meaning in the choice, and memory too.
Perhaps the giver wanted to be recognized, but not immediately. Perhaps the paper was meant to whisper, not shout. Craddock frowned, but she saw the flicker of interest behind his eyes. You make it sound almost poetic. Murder often is, Miss Marple replied quietly. A pattern of pride or jealousy or guilt, woven neatly beneath the surface, like this silver thread. They sat for a moment in companionable silence, listening to the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, the snow had begun again, swirling softly past the window. Craddock finished his tea and stood. You may be right, of course. I'll have a word with our London liaison, but I'll wager it's just coincidence. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Coincidence is a dear friend of truth, Inspector. They often arrive at the same door. Only one knocks a little later. He chuckled, shaking his head as he left. You do have a way of putting things. When he was gone, Miss Marple turned back to the scrap of paper on her desk. She studied the silver bells once more, the delicate weave of their embossed edges. Somewhere, she thought, someone had wrapped a secret, tied it up with ribbon and good manners, hidden it in plain sight, and if she could trace that paper to its maker, perhaps she could trace the lie it covered. She lifted her cup again, eyes soft but alert, and whispered to herself, every murderer leaves a pattern, just like this paper. By afternoon, St. Mary Mead had resumed its usual rhythm, outwardly peaceful, inwardly humming with curiosity. The snow had begun to melt in soft rivulets down the cottage lanes, and the sound of the church bell drifted lazily through the air, calling the choir to hymn practice. Yet beneath that calm tone lay something restless, something whispering between the hedgerows and along the narrow lanes. Word had spread, as it always did, faster than the morning post. The visitor at the vicarage had died suddenly, they said. A fall, or a fainting spell, or something darker, depending on who one asked. And, naturally, every version included a different culprit. At the grocer's, Mrs. Weatherby was certain it was jealousy. You mark my words, she declared over a mound of oranges. That niece of his never liked him much. Always thought she deserved more from the family purse. At the post office, Miss Finch confided to anyone buying stamps that the matter had to do with inheritance. I saw the solicitor's letter myself, she murmured. Thick envelope, London seal.
Money changes everything, even in a village like ours. And, as always, Miss Marple listened quietly, pleasantly, without ever seeming to pry. She had been on her way to the church, her knitting bag in hand, when she heard the hum of voices within.
The choir was practising O Come, All Ye Faithful, and the sound was quite lovely, though not quite harmonious. Every now and then a note wavered, as if one or two singers were preoccupied. Miss Marple slipped into the last pew, her presence as unremarkable as a shadow. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Aldersley, stood near the front, her hands clasped firmly over the hymn book. She was a kind woman, capable and brisk, but today there was a faint tremor in her manner, a tightening around the mouth, a distracted glance toward the door. A few rows behind her sat young Clara, the deceased's niece. She was pale, her gloves clutched too tightly, and her eyes rarely lifted from the page. The contrast between the two women might have seemed ordinary to anyone else, but Miss Marple noticed something small and therefore important when Mrs. Aldersley mentioned the visitor's name during a brief announcement. We will, of course, remember Mr. Penrith in our prayers. Clara flinched, not visibly to all, but enough that Miss Marple caught the tremor, the quick dart of her gaze toward the vicar's wife. And Mrs. Aldersley, for her part, did not look back. The hymn resumed, though now with less heart. The organ's soft hum filled the air, and outside the window snow began to fall again in delicate, half-hearted flakes. Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly in her lap as she thought, When the practice ended, small groups formed near the doorway, whispers blooming like frost flowers. They say he'd been planning to change his will. He'd quarrelled with the niece only last week. London money, that's always trouble. Miss Marple smiled politely to a few familiar faces, exchanged a word about the weather, and made her way to the vestry where Mrs. Aldersley was putting away hymn sheets. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "such a sad thing for the village, isn't it? I do hope the vicar's keeping well through all the upset." Mrs. Aldersley's hands stilled. Yes, of course. He's terribly busy, of course, with arrangements." Miss Marple nodded, observing how the woman's gaze darted briefly toward the window, toward the path where Clara had just passed. "Such a dreadful shock for the poor girl," she murmured. "So far from home, and at Christmas too." "Indeed," the vicar's wife replied quickly, "but she's been quite composed, quite collected." It was a curious choice of words. Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful hum. "I always think London leaves a mark on people," she said lightly, "even when they've been away a while." Mrs. Aldersley's expression flickered, only for a moment, at the word London. The brief tightening around her eyes did not escape Miss Marple's notice. She smiled gently, as though she'd said nothing at all. When she left the church, the air felt colder, the village quieter, the gossip already shifting toward new embellishments. But one detail held firm in Miss Marple's mind. Mrs. Aldersley had flinched, not at the hymn, not at the memory of death, but at the mere mention of London. And in Miss Marple's experience, London always meant something. It was where secrets began, and sometimes where they refused to stay buried. Chapter 4. The Missing Parcel. The day had brightened a little after lunch, though the sun remained shy, hiding behind a veil of thin clouds. Miss Marple, wrapped in her grey shawl, made her way down the high street where snow had turned to slush, and puddles reflected the soft winter sky. The air carried the smell of roasting chestnuts from the corner stand, mingled with something less festive, the sharp tang of gossip that always followed tragedy. At the butcher's shop, young Tommy Briggs was sweeping the step, his red scarf nearly swallowing his small chin. He was a wiry boy of perhaps 14, quick with a grin but even quicker to talk. Miss Marple greeted him kindly, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "Good afternoon, Tommy. Your broom seems to be getting more exercise than you are," she said. He laughed, a little embarrassed. "Mr. Holloway says it's good for my character, miss. Though I'd rather it was sausages I was carrying than snow." "Ah, but you do carry other things, don't you?" Miss Marple replied gently. "Your rounds take you nearly everywhere." Tommy's chest puffed with pride. "That's right, miss."
"All over, with the schoolhouse, the vicarage, even up to Mrs. Harper's sometimes. I know every doorstep in St. Mary Mead." "Indeed," she said, lowering her voice just slightly.
"And I dare say you notice more than most while you're about it." Tommy hesitated, glancing toward the shop window where the butcher was busy wrapping a joint of lamb. "I suppose I do," he murmured. Miss Marple smiled in that kind, coaxing way of hers.
"Tell me, my dear, about that parcel you delivered to the vicarage."
"The one that wasn't on your list." His eyes widened. "You heard about that?" "Oh, one hears things," Miss Marple said lightly. "And sometimes the smallest things turn out to be rather important." Tommy looked around to make sure no one was listening. Then he leaned closer. "It was just before Christmas Eve, miss. I'd finished my usual deliveries, and I was cleaning up when a gentleman came by, not from the village. Said he had a parcel for the vicarage, but couldn't find anyone home."
"Asked me to drop it off since I'd be passing." "A gentleman," Miss Marple repeated softly.
"What sort?" "Well dressed," the boy said, frowning in thought. "Tall with gloves. Spoke proper like London folk do. He gave me a shilling for my trouble. More than fair if you ask me." "And the parcel?" "Wrapped in brown paper and tied neat with string."
"Light them."
"Made a funny sound when I carried it. Like tiny bells inside." Miss Marple's eyes glinted.
"Bells?"
He nodded earnestly. "I remember because it jingled when I went over the cobbles."
"Not loud, more like a faint tinkling, like something inside was shifting." She considered this quietly, her fingers brushing her shawl. "And you gave it to whom?"
Mrs. Aldersley took it herself, Tommy said. Said she'd see it was put with the others under the tree. Only I didn't see no tree at the time, just the drawing room half decorated and the vicar looking flustered. Did the gentleman say his name? Tommy shook his head.
No, miss.
But he said to tell the vicar it was from an old friend, a gift to remind him of better days. Miss Marple's expression softened.
Did he now?
Tommy looked puzzled. Was it something bad, miss?
Only I heard folks say the visitor at the vicarage, or the one who died, he came from London too. Miss Marple smiled faintly.
Nothing bad, Tommy, only curious. Sometimes the past sends small parcels to the present, and they don't always bring joy. He seemed relieved at her tone, and she slipped him a peppermint from her pocket before taking her leave. As she walked away, the faint jingle of the church bell in the distance seemed to echo the boy's words. Tiny bells hidden in a brown paper parcel. By the time she reached the lane toward her cottage, Miss Marple's mind was busy at work. A London stranger, an unlisted delivery, and paper that shimmered with silver bells. The pattern was tightening, thread by delicate thread. She paused by her gate, looking back toward the village green. Somewhere among those tidy cottages lay the truth, wrapped as neatly as that parcel, and just as carefully sealed. He swore it jingled, she murmured to herself, like tiny bells inside, and Miss Marple, who believed nothing in life was ever wrapped without reason, smiled faintly as the snow began again to fall. The late afternoon was quiet, almost reverent, as Miss Marple made her way back to the vicarage. The sun had begun to dip behind the low hills, casting long, slanting shadows over the snow-speckled lane. A faint wind rustled the bare branches of the hawthorn, and the distant church bell tolled softly, as though marking the passage of time in deliberate, measured strokes. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the gate latch, her shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders. She had already walked these paths twice that day, yet she felt compelled to see the sitting-room once more. There was something about the corner near the hearth that had not settled in her mind. Sometimes, she believed, a house remembers what the occupants would rather forget. The vicarage door creaked softly as she entered. No one seemed to notice her passage. The household was absorbed in hushed preparations for evening prayers. She moved with quiet purpose, her knitting bag swaying gently at her side, and approached the sitting-room where the fire had once burned so brightly. Her eyes drifted to the hearth, the blackened tiles still faintly warm from earlier use. She crouched, brushing her hand along the edge, and noticed something peculiar. A tile near the far corner was slightly misaligned. She tapped it gently, feeling the faint hollow beneath. With careful fingers, she lifted the tile, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside there was a scrap of paper, charred at the edges but unmistakable in design. The silver-embossed bells were blackened, curled, yet still gleamed faintly where the fire had not touched them. Miss Marple's heart quickened with quiet satisfaction. She recognized the paper immediately, the same luxury wrapping she had examined at her own desk that morning. She pressed the scrap gently between her fingers. The faint smell of smoke lingered, sharp and telling. Someone had tried to destroy it, she thought, yet the attempt had been incomplete. Perhaps they had been interrupted, or perhaps they had underestimated the stubbornness of paper. Sitting back on her heels, she considered the implications. Paper does not burn of its own volition.
Only guilt burns paper.
Only someone wishing to erase evidence, however imperfectly, would risk fire to conceal a secret. The neat fold of the scrap, now curled and blackened, spoke louder than any words could. Miss Marple let her eyes roam the room. The furniture was still, orderly, the festive decorations untouched in the fading light. Yet beneath the calm surface there had been a small, deliberate act, an attempt to hide something, to erase a trace of what had been brought into the house. She placed the scrap carefully on a small tray, examining the delicate pattern. The bells and silver threads shimmered faintly in the dying light, stubbornly holding their shape against the evidence of fire. It was almost as if the paper itself refused to lie, quietly proclaiming the presence of someone who had thought themselves clever, but had left a mark all the same. The vicarage, so accustomed to ordinary village life, had been touched by a hand from elsewhere, meticulous, purposeful, and secretive. That hand had delivered gifts, yes, but also suspicion, subtlety, and perhaps the first thread of danger that led to death. Miss Marple rose slowly, adjusting her shawl, and looked once more at the hearth. The loose tile was now replaced, leaving nothing obvious for the casual eye. Yet, in her mind, the hidden scrap remained vivid, a clue that connected the village to London, the ordinary to the extraordinary, the present to a carefully concealed past. She walked to the window and gazed down the lane. The snow glimmered in soft shades of gold and grey. A deep sense of calm settled over her, even as the weight of discovery pressed lightly at her thoughts. Only a small scrap, only a corner of paper, and yet it spoke volumes. Someone had acted with care, yet left the tiniest trace. Miss Marple whispered to herself softly, as if acknowledging a quiet truth. Only guilt burns paper. And for the first time that day, the village felt as though it had begun to yield its secret. Not all, but enough to suggest that the pieces were slowly, inexorably coming together. Chapter 5. A Visitor from London. The morning light filtered softly through Miss Marple's kitchen window, dusting the table with a pale glow. Steam rose from her teacup as she arranged a small pile of gardening books, intending to catalogue notes for the coming winter. The village outside was quiet. The occasional clatter of a shovel or the distant barking of a dog punctuated the stillness. It was the kind of morning where one might expect nothing more remarkable than frost on the hedges and the scent of dried lavender in the air. Yet, as Miss Marple thumbed through the pages of an old leather-bound gardening ledger, a slip of paper fluttered to the floor. She picked it up, smoothing the crease with delicate fingers. The stub was unmistakable, a train ticket neatly printed with small, precise handwriting indicating the purchaser's name. Mr. Penrith, the deceased guest at the vicarage. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The date printed on the stub was 2 days earlier than the day the vicarage had reported his arrival. 2 days before the fete, 2 days before the gifts were distributed, 2 days when no one had seemed to notice him. She set the ticket on the table and studied it closely. The destination was London, the same city she had been considering in connection with the silver-belled wrapping paper, the same city Mrs. Harper had alluded to in conversation. He came early, she murmured to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. To meet someone in secret, Miss Marple allowed her mind to wander through the possibilities. Who could he have wished to meet? The vicar's wife, the niece, perhaps even some other visitor from London whose presence the village had not yet noted. The very notion of secrecy fascinated her. It was always in the small, quiet movements that truth revealed itself. She recalled the boy at the butcher's who had delivered the brown paper parcel. Could this early arrival be linked to that mysterious package? The faint jingle of bells had resonated in her memory like a secret song. And now this ticket suggested a deliberate planning, a series of steps quietly undertaken. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, knitting needles idle in her lap. The calendar on the wall reminded her that Christmas Eve had been just 3 days ago, yet already the timeline seemed compressed, tangled. An early arrival, a parcel unlisted, wrapping paper burned and hidden, a visitor from London with precise manners. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and she could see the faint pattern forming in the corner of her mind. She recalled how Mrs. Harper had described that London gentleman, hands that folded neatly, shoes polished to a mirror shine, perfect manners. Perhaps he was connected to this early journey. Perhaps he, too, had brought more than gifts. Intentions, motives, secrets carefully wrapped beneath civility. Miss Marple placed the ticket beside the charred paper from the hearth, the shimmer of silver threads in her memory, the faint jingle of the parcel. And now this slip of paper formed a quiet chain, linking London to St. Mary Mead, elegance to deception, ordinary days to extraordinary events. She closed her eyes briefly, considering the implications. Time had a way of speaking. In tickets, in arrivals, in those small, almost imperceptible deviations from the schedule everyone believed was ordinary. Miss Marple's blue eyes gleamed. The early arrival suggested planning, and planning suggested forethought, deliberation. The deceased had not simply been a casual guest, swept along by circumstance. He had orchestrated part of his own story, perhaps unknowingly leaving hints for those careful enough to notice. Setting the stub aside, she rose from the chair and glanced out the window at the faint sparkle of frost. The village seemed still, peaceful, and yet, beneath that calm, invisible threads connected the events she had observed. London to the vicarage, paper to parcel, arrival to deception, she murmured, almost to herself with the faintest smile. He came early. To meet someone in secret. Miss Marple knew that timing, as always, was key, and those who watched carefully would discover what the hasty or inattentive could not see. By the early afternoon, the pale winter light had softened further, casting long shadows across the vicarage garden. Miss Marple walked slowly along the path, her steps deliberate, her shawl tucked tightly around her shoulders against the lingering chill. She had returned to speak with Mrs. Aldersley once more, the vicar's wife whose gentle composure often concealed the keenest of observations. The door opened before she could knock. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Aldersley greeted her, voice polite but edged with a quiet tension.
"I was wondering when you might call. Please come in. I
have something to tell you, though I confess it is rather troubling." Miss Marple offered a soft smile. "Troubles are easier to understand when shared, my dear. Do sit down." They settled in the drawing-room, the fire crackling softly. Mrs. Aldersley arranged her gloves neatly in her lap, her eyes distant for a moment before settling on Miss Marple's calm,
attentive gaze. "It was the day before the fête," she began, her voice almost a whisper.
"I saw Mr. Penrith, the deceased guest, sitting by the writing desk in the drawing-room. He appeared to be composing a letter. He was quiet, deliberate, and entirely absorbed in his work. I thought it curious, but it did not seem extraordinary at the time." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And what became of the letter?" she asked gently. Mrs. Aldersley's hands twitched slightly.
"That is the strange part.
After I left the room briefly to check on the preparations, it was gone, vanished. I searched, thinking he had merely misplaced it, but it had disappeared completely." "Vanished, you say?" Miss Marple repeated softly. She leaned forward, eyes thoughtful. "Did anyone else enter the room during that time?" The vicar's wife shook her head.
"Not that I am aware of. Only the servants came and went, but they are all trustworthy, or so I believed," she sighed. "I cannot help but think someone may have taken it, but why?"
"And what could it have contained that someone wished to conceal?" Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the edge of her knitting basket. Letters, she thought, often reveal the inner workings of a mind, intentions, confessions, hopes, or even threats. Yet, in the wrong hands, a letter can vanish before its truth is known, leaving only questions behind. "Letters tell the truth," she murmured. "Unless someone tears it away." Mrs. Aldersley's lips pressed together. "That is precisely what worries me, Miss Marple." It was a private note, I am certain.
"Yet someone has prevented it from reaching anyone."
"The act itself is deliberate, and I cannot fathom its purpose. Perhaps it concerned the fate, perhaps not. But it was clearly intended for another eye." Miss Marple considered this, her blue eyes narrowing slightly. The combination of the missing letter and the mysterious parcel, the silver-belled paper and the London visitor painted a picture growing steadily more intricate. Each small detail, seemingly innocuous, now connected, not in obvious ways, but through the faintest threads of human intention. "Did you notice anything unusual about the way he wrote it?" she asked.
"His demeanour, his manner, the direction of the words."
Mrs. Aldersley hesitated. "He was focused, very neat."
"Even in the smallest movements precise."
"I remember thinking he folded the paper carefully after writing, as though he expected it to be handled, yet secretly treasured. He might have been trying to hide something, or perhaps to protect it." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "And that, my dear, is the part most worth noting. Protection implies a secret, and a secret invites attention. Somewhere in that room someone else saw the potential of that letter and decided it was better it not be seen at all. The fire crackled as silence settled between them. Outside, snow continued to fall lightly, muffling the sounds of the village. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. When she rose to leave, she gave Mrs. Aldersley a small, comforting smile.
"Thank you for your honesty."
Sometimes the smallest disclosures, a glance, a misplaced letter, reveal more than the grandest gestures. We shall see where it leads. As she stepped into the fading light, Miss Marple whispered to herself, softly, almost to the snow, "Letters tell the truth, unless someone tears it away." Chapter 6. Tinsel and Temptation. The morning after the fete was tinged with a soft melancholy. The village seemed quieter than usual, as if the cobblestones themselves held their breath. Miss Marple strolled slowly through the lanes, her shawl wrapped tightly, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. She paused by the vicarage gate, recalling the scene from the previous evening. Laughter, tinsel, the flicker of candlelight, and the subtle currents of attention weaving through the room. She began her gentle inquiries among the villagers, as she often did, listening more than speaking. From the kitchen staff to the postmistress, and even the choir members who had helped arrange the carols, Miss Marple collected fragments of memory. Each recollection was modest, unassuming, yet she treated every word as though it were a precious clue, a stitch in a larger tapestry. One of the more telling accounts came from Mrs. Weatherby, the vicarage cook. "He presented it with such ceremony, Miss Marple," she said, polishing a small silver tray that had been used for the evening tea, a brooch delicate with emeralds. "I thought it curious. He barely knew the lady, yet he smiled as if it meant more than a passing fancy." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she leaned closer.
"And the lady?"
"How did she receive it?" "She was startled, naturally, a little embarrassed too, but she accepted it with grace, as though she had expected something, though not quite this. Her hand trembled slightly when she held it. As she gathered more accounts, Miss Marple pieced together the sequence of events, the careful arrangement of ornaments, the distribution of gifts, the laughter and faint glances exchanged beneath wreaths of tinsel. And then the brooch, not merely a piece of jewellery, but an emblem of intent, a symbol that the deceased had chosen carefully. Even amidst the gaiety, what struck Miss Marple most was a small, almost unnoticed detail. The brooch was intended for someone else entirely. A subtle gesture, misdirected perhaps by circumstance or design, now misread by the recipient and those around her. The implication stirred a quiet thrill of curiosity. Who had it been meant for, and why had the exchange gone awry? Was it a simple mistake, or had the giver acted with deliberate intention? Miss Marple's mind wandered through possibilities. The brooch, gleaming with emerald fire, might have represented affection, or perhaps remorse, a gesture of guilt carefully veiled beneath the glow of celebration. Gifts, she had learned, were often more revealing than words, and in small villages, intentions could be both hidden and exposed in equal measure. She recalled seeing Mr. Penrith at the fete, polite, measured, offering conversation that seemed casual but contained subtle probes, questions of opinion, of family, of past acquaintances. Every action, every smile, she now understood, had been carefully calibrated, leaving traces only an observant eye could follow. Miss Marple paused in the lane,
imagining the brooch in its mislaid context, a present meant for one, received by another,
stirring wonder and perhaps jealousy or even resentment. It was a quiet drama, unfolding under the soft flicker of candlelight and the delicate rustle of tinsel. She smiled to herself. In village life, small gestures often carried the weight of grand declarations, and in this case the weight had been enough to rouse curiosity, suspicion, and now, in retrospect, the faint scent of danger. By the time she returned home, her knitting had been left idle, forgotten in the midst of reflection. The brooch, the party, the misplaced intentions, all were threads in a fabric she was slowly unravelling. Each detail, subtle though it seemed, added to a picture growing more complex by the hour. Miss Marple finally sat by her window, the late afternoon sun casting a soft glow over her shawl. "The brooch," she murmured softly, "was meant for another woman entirely." And in that quiet admission, she felt the first faint stirrings of understanding, the gentle, deliberate movements of human hearts hidden beneath tinsel and polite smiles, waiting to be read. The village was calm that morning, yet the air carried a subtle undercurrent of unease. Snow had begun to melt in irregular patches along the cobblestones, leaving puddles that mirrored the pale sky. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village green, her fingers lightly brushing the shawl around her shoulders. Her mind replayed the evening at the fête, laughter, candles, the glitter of tinsel, and now, increasingly, the small but telling fragments of memory brought to her attention by attentive villagers. At the vicarage, she was greeted by Mrs. Briggs, whose keen eyes always seemed to observe what others overlooked. "Miss Marple," she said, voice hushed as though the walls themselves might listen. "I remembered something just this morning."
A small thing, yes, but it might be important. Miss Marple tilted her head, encouraging her to continue. "It was near the tree," Mrs. Briggs explained.
After the guests had left, I noticed a scrap of paper caught under a branch, a gift tag torn from a present. It fluttered in the breeze, and I picked it up carefully. It read, or at least what was left of it, to L, with forgiveness. Only a part of the name remained. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the handle of her knitting bag. Her blue eyes narrowed. "Forgiveness," she murmured softly as though tasting the word. A curious choice at any time, and more so when attached to a gift. The cook, Mrs. Weatherby, had also noticed the fragment. She had tucked it aside for safekeeping, unaware of its significance, yet Miss Marple saw its importance immediately. A gift tag, torn and fluttering under the tree, was more than decoration. It was a message. It spoke of intention, of emotion, and perhaps of guilt. She recalled the brooch given the previous evening. A gift misdirected, a gesture meant for one person received by another. And now this tag, with its fragmentary plea for forgiveness, hinted at connections unseen, motivations unspoken. Miss Marple's mind, always attuned to subtle human signals, began piecing together the possibilities. Who was L? And what required forgiveness? The possibilities stretched quietly before her, each as delicate and dangerous as the tinsel adorning the tree. Villagers had been speaking of jealousy and inheritance, of London visitors and unexpected arrivals. Yet this small tag, torn and half-hidden, suggested a more intimate drama, one of personal emotion, rather than financial intrigue. Miss Marple tucked the scrap carefully into her pocket. She thought about human nature, how people often speak in gestures rather than words, how they reveal themselves in small, unnoticed ways. A gift tag, a torn piece of paper, could carry truths far weightier than spoken explanations. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, and the snows sparkled faintly in the soft winter light. The village seemed serene, even idyllic, yet the tag had revealed that beneath calm surfaces lay currents of remorse, longing, and perhaps deception. As she walked back toward her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the subtle significance of the word forgiveness. In her experience, it was rarely offered freely in moments of deceit. Often, it was a veneer, a polite mask over unspoken resentment, or a lure designed to draw attention away from the truth. She paused at the garden gate, glancing down at the remaining snow. In her mind's eye, she could see the evening's events replayed, the careful placement of gifts, the glances exchanged beneath the tinsel, the misdelivered brooch, and now the torn tag fluttering like a silent witness. "Forgiveness," she whispered softly, eyes narrowing. "A word killers never truly mean." And in that quiet recognition, the threads of the mystery seemed to tighten once more, connecting human emotion, subtle deceit, and the faint traces left behind for those perceptive enough to notice. Miss Marple smiled faintly, knowing that every small piece of evidence, even a torn gift tag, carried a story waiting to be read. Chapter 7. The truth in the wrapping. The morning was crisp, the sky pale and clear, and Miss Marple's small garden glistened with frost as she sipped her tea. Yet her mind was far from the familiar roses and holly. It lingered on the scrap of paper, the silver-embossed bells, and the subtle but persistent thread that had begun to weave through every detail of the village mystery. Today she intended to follow that thread to its origin. With the charred paper carefully tucked in her bag, Miss Marple made her way to her small study, where a collection of old letters, catalogues, and reference books awaited. She had long learned that the village held few secrets that could not be illuminated by careful research, and London, with all its distant, bustling order, often left behind subtle traces that only the most observant could recognize. The silver-belled paper, she realized, was distinctive, not merely luxurious but marked in a particular way. Only one department store had ever carried it, Bramwell and Hinton, a refined establishment in the West End. Its clientele was exclusive, the sort of family who purchased stationery for private purposes, often under discretion, for connections that were rarely casual. Miss Marple remembered a distant acquaintance mentioning such a family many years ago, one whose members occasionally travelled incognito to avoid recognition. She compared the embossed pattern against old catalogues she had saved from her London visits. There it was, a delicate row of silver bells, slightly raised from the paper, a design sold for only a handful of seasons, purchased only once, years ago, by a family whose name had since faded from memory, but remained in the records. Her eyes narrowed as she considered the implications. If the paper came from that family, and it was now in St. Mary Mead, what path had it travelled? The answer, she suspected, lay not merely in the store, but in the man who had carried it here. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the deceased guest. Mr. Penrith, as he was known at the vicarage, had seemed polite, unobtrusive, even charming. Yet now she began to suspect that the polite exterior concealed a past carefully disguised. She recalled reports from Mrs. Harper, the widow of a London visitor with perfect manners, a man who spoke in cautious, measured tones. Could it be the same person? She examined her notes and old employment records, and there it was. Mr. Penrith had once been employed in London under a different name, in a department store that matched the exclusive clientele of Bramwell and Hinton. Only years later had he resurfaced, travelling to villages, offering courtesy and charm, seemingly a stranger, yet carrying traces of his past wherever he went. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. He wasn't the guest they thought he was, she whispered. It made sense in a subtle, intricate way. The London connection, the parcel with silver-belled paper, the careful attention to minor details, the effort to arrive unnoticed, all pointed to a man guarding his identity, yet inadvertently revealing himself through choices others dismissed as trivial. Every gift, every gesture, every arrival, 2 days earlier than reported, was a breadcrumb along a path only the observant could follow. She thought back to the torn gift tag fluttering under the Christmas tree, to L with forgiveness. Perhaps a link, subtle but deliberate, between the man's past and the connections he had formed anew, and the burned scrap behind the hearth, a failed attempt to erase what could not truly be hidden. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the warmth seeping through her fingers as the quiet certainty of discovery settled over her. The pattern was revealed, though faint and delicate, and those who had overlooked the small details had missed the truth. The visitor from London carried not merely gifts, but a hidden life, a secret carefully wrapped in civility and charm. And in that moment she understood fully. The village had welcomed a stranger, yet he had been no stranger at all. The evidence, the paper, the timing, the gestures, all converged quietly into the revelation that the deceased had worn a carefully constructed mask, and only the keen eye of a patient observer could see the man beneath it. Miss Marple laid the paper down gently, her blue eyes thoughtful. "He wasn't the guest they thought he was," she repeated, almost aloud, savouring the truth that had been patiently uncovered. The sky above St. Mary Mead had begun to blush, with the colours of dusk, pale pinks and soft purples spilling across the horizon. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane toward Mrs. Harper's cottage, her shawl wrapped tightly, fingers lightly brushing the edges of her knitting bag. The village was quiet, save for the distant toll of the church bell and the faint crunch of snow underfoot. There was a weight in the air, a stillness that promised revelations. Mrs. Harper opened the door before Miss Marple could knock. Her hands were trembling slightly, her eyes wide and shadowed with concern. "Miss Marple," she whispered, stepping aside to let the visitor in. I feared you would come. I knew there were questions I could not avoid forever." Miss Marple smiled gently, her voice warm and steady. "Sometimes it is the smallest truths that bring the greatest clarity. Sit with me, my dear. Tell me what you know as you can." They settled by the fire, its amber light casting soft shadows across the room. Mrs. Harper clutched a teacup, her fingers shaking slightly. She looked at the floor before speaking. "It was years ago," she began, voice low. "I helped him once. Mr. Penrith. I did not know then what he truly was capable of. I only knew he needed assistance, and I could not refuse. It seemed a small matter at the time." Miss Marple nodded, her blue eyes calm and encouraging. "And what kind of assistance was this, Mrs.
Harper? He had secrets," Mrs. Harper said, her voice trembling. "Secrets about people in the village, people who trusted him, who never suspected. I helped him with arrangements, letters, parcels, things he said were harmless.
But I knew deep down that some of it was blackmail. He coerced one of the villagers quietly, subtly, and I assisted him, though I wished I had refused. I thought I could contain it. I thought it would never return." Miss Marple's gaze softened, yet her mind worked with quiet precision. "And did you think, Mrs. Harper, that he would not come back for more?" she asked gently, allowing the question to settle without accusation. Mrs. Harper's shoulders shook. Tears welled in her eyes. I believed it would end, that he would be gone. But he returned, and I realized then it was not a gift he brought, not truly. The wrapping paper, the parcels, they were not presents. They were tools of the same crime. I see it now. The paper wasn't from his gift, it was from his crime. Miss Marple listened quietly, letting the confession unfold. The warmth of the fire and the stillness of the evening seemed to hold the weight of the revelation, giving it space to breathe. Mrs. Harper's voice wavered, but there was honesty. In her admission, a moral reckoning that had been long deferred. "He manipulated us," Mrs. Harper continued, almost whispering. "We thought him charming, polite, a man of refinement. But underneath there was calculation. He had always intended to return, and I fear, Miss Marple, that some of the suffering in the village could have been prevented if I had spoken sooner." Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering, her tone gentle yet firm. "What matters now is that we understand, that we piece together what was done, not with anger, but with clarity. And that truth, Mrs. Harper, allows the village to heal." Harper nodded slowly, a tear rolling down her cheek. "Yes, Miss Marple, I only hope the consequences reach him at last, and that the wronged may find some quiet peace." The fire crackled softly, echoing the unspoken weight of confession. Outside, the last light of day faded, leaving the village in calm twilight. Miss Marple rose, offering a small, reassuring smile. "We have learned much today, my dear. The threads of deception are now visible, and with them, justice, however measured, will follow." Mrs. Harper's sigh was one of relief, mingled with sorrow, as Miss Marple stepped into the cool evening. The wrapping paper, once thought a simple token, now carried the weight of past misdeeds, the silent record of guilt, and the first hint of closure for the village. In the fading light, Miss Marple whispered to herself, softly but with certainty. The wrapping paper wasn't from his gift, it was from his crime. Chapter 8. The Unwrapping of Truth. The vicarage was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight, streaming through the tall windows and illuminating the polished floorboards. Miss Marple moved among the familiar chairs and tables, arranging cups and saucers with deliberate care. Today, the entire village, or at least those connected to the mystery, would gather under one roof. The air carried a faint scent of tea and lemon, mingling with the subtle aroma of burning logs from the hearth. Outside, the snow had softened into delicate drifts, as though nature herself had paused for the occasion. One by one, the guests arrived. Mrs. Aldersley, pale but composed, offered Miss Marple a quiet nod. Mrs. Harper lingered near the doorway,
hands folded, eyes alert yet apprehensive.
The vicar, cheeks flushed from both excitement and nerves, welcomed the visitors with polite words that barely masked his curiosity. Even young Tommy Briggs appeared, shyly clutching a small notebook, eager to witness the unravelling of events he had helped observe. Miss Marple took her place at the head of the room, her shawl draped neatly, her knitting bag tucked beside her chair. The chatter settled gradually, replaced by a hush that carried anticipation like a delicate thread. She sipped her tea, letting the silence hold its weight, then set the cup down and looked around with her calm, measured gaze. "Thank you all for coming," she began softly, her voice warm yet firm. "We are gathered not merely for tea, but to understand what occurred during the recent festivities at the vicarage. It has been a time of confusion, sorrow, and uncertainty, yet the truth, once revealed, is often simpler than we expect." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "Let us consider the wrapping paper first. Many of you remember the luxury silver-belled paper, which seemed at first merely a decoration. Yet it is the paper itself that holds the key." The guests exchanged glances, curiosity prickling at the edges of polite restraint. Miss Marple continued, "This is paper purchased years ago in London, was used by only one family. The deceased guest, Mr. Penrith, had once been employed under a false name, connected to this very paper. When he arrived in St. Mary Mead, he carried more than gifts. He carried a secret." Her eyes rested briefly on Mrs. Harper, who shivered slightly. "The parcel delivered by young Tommy Briggs," Miss Marple explained, "contained not merely the brooch or trifles, but a letter intended to blackmail. When the paper was burned behind the hearth, it was a failed attempt to hide that evidence. To disguise the letter further, Mr. Penrith, or the person who took advantage of his arrival, reused the old London wrapping, assuming it would mislead all but the most careful observer." She held up a charred scrap, letting it catch the light. The blackmail letter, hidden and nearly destroyed, was concealed beneath what seemed to be a gift. But it is not the gift that mattered. It was the wrapping. It pointed to a history, a connection, and a motive that only the observant could discern. A hush settled over the room. Even the vicar's wife, who had trembled in her confession, leaned forward slightly, absorbing the revelation. The pieces of the puzzle, the early arrival, the torn gift tag, the London connection, the parcel, the charred paper, now formed a coherent pattern, each step logical, deliberate, and quietly poetic. Miss Marple's gaze moved across the faces before her, gentle yet unyielding.
Every act, every gesture, no matter how small, leaves a trace.
And it is in those traces that we find the truth. The village has seen both kindness and mischief, secrecy and courage, but today clarity emerges from the shadows. She poured a final cup of tea, the steam rising like a soft veil, and smiled faintly. Let us remember then that sometimes the smallest details, a scrap of paper, a flicker of intention, reveal far more than grand gestures ever could. The wrapping was not incidental. It was everything, and as the tea was passed and quiet nods acknowledged, Miss Marple felt a gentle satisfaction. The web had been unravelled, the hidden story exposed, and the village, once anxious, could now breathe in the warmth of understanding. The firelight flickered across the vicarage drawing room. casting soft shadows over the gathered villagers. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting bag resting beside her chair, her blue eyes calm and observant. The hum of anticipation in the room was tempered by the warmth of the hearth and the faint scent of tea and lemon cakes. The time had come to uncover the final piece of the puzzle, and she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle gently on her shoulders. Mrs. Aldersley, the vicar's wife, sat rigidly in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She glanced at Miss Marple, eyes wide as if hoping the detective could speak the words her own heart could not yet form. Miss Marple offered a small, reassuring smile. "It is not shame I seek," she said softly, "only truth, so that the village may rest and you may find peace." A tremor ran through Mrs. Aldersley's hands, and she took a deep, shuddering breath.
"It was true," she began, her voice barely above a whisper.
"Many years ago, I married quietly far from here.
No one knew.
It was a secret I carried carefully, hoping it would never surface.
But the blackmailer, Mr. Penrith, discovered it. He threatened to reveal everything, to ruin me.
I was terrified.
I feared not only gossip, but the loss of reputation, the shame it would bring to my family and the church." Miss Marple inclined her head gently, letting the confession unfold without interruption.
"And what did you do, my dear?" she asked softly, her tone steady, compassionate, yet imbued with quiet curiosity. Mrs. Aldersley's eyes filled with tears. "I panicked. I thought only to protect myself, to prevent the letter from reaching anyone. I took the parcel, reused the old London wrapping paper, the one from the store that Mr. Penrith had once used, and burned the letter. I did not intend harm, only to hide the truth, to keep a secret that was mine. But I see now, it set a chain of events I never anticipated." A hush fell over the room. Even the youngest villagers, who had watched quietly from the edge of the gathering, felt the tension ease slightly under the calm, measured revelation. The act had not been violent, yet it had rippled through the village, leaving questions and unease in its wake. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice carrying gently through the room. "We all wrap our sins in what seems safest at the time, words, actions, even paper. And yet paper burns. It cannot hold the truth forever. You acted out of fear, yes, but the evidence remained, if only in fragments, for those who watched carefully." Mrs. Aldersley's shoulders sagged with relief, a tear rolling down her cheek.
"I only hoped
that no one would be hurt." "No one was," Miss Marple said quietly. "Fear and secrecy can appear dangerous, yet they need not lead to violence. The village has learned that truth, though delicate, emerges through careful observation, compassion, and patience. Your intent was to protect, not to harm, and that matters greatly." The other villagers exchanged soft nods, understanding at last the context of events that had seemed so mysterious in the days prior. There was no anger, only a collective recognition that human frailty, fear, and intention often create patterns that seem sinister until gently unravelled. Mrs. Aldersley looked around the room, eyes meeting those of neighbours who had once exchanged puzzled glances.
"I am sorry," she whispered.
"To everyone for the worry, the confusion, and for hiding behind my fear." Miss Marple reached out lightly, resting a comforting hand on hers. "You have confessed, and that is enough. Secrets, once revealed, lose their power to harm. The village may now return to its calm, and you may carry forward with honesty and grace." As the evening settled, the glow of the fire softened further. Outside, the last hints of dusk faded into gentle night. Miss Marple thought quietly, almost to herself. "We all wrap our sin, but paper burns." And in that serene moment, the village exhaled collectively. The mystery had been unravelled without violence, the truth revealed with gentle precision, and the moral clarity settled softly over St. Mary Mead, like the last snow of winter melting into quiet, steady streams.